Well, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's Security Boulevard webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon. I'm the moderator for today's event, and as always, I welcome you. We have a star-studded lineup today, and I'm so excited to have this conversation with everybody. But before we get started on today's webinar, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, you will be able to access it later on demand. We are going to be sending out an email later on today that includes a link to access the webinar on demand. And of course, we are taking questions from the audience. So if at any time you have a question for any of our panelists, please don't wait, don't hesitate, just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your questions. And hopefully we'll have a few minutes near the end of today's webinar to go over the audience questions. All right, with that, we're going to go ahead and kick off today's webinar. Application Security, the Next Generation, a panel discussion. Okay, our speakers today, oh my gosh, we have, like I said before, a star-studded lineup. So I am going to do a real quick introduction of everybody, and then and hopefully everybody will tell us a little bit about yourself. So we'll start off with Tom Eston, who is the Senior Manager of Penetration Testing at Veracode. Hi, Tom, how are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm excellent, thanks. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. I've been at Veracode for 5 years, and I manage our penetration testing team. So I get to see all kinds of interesting vulnerabilities, and hopefully get to talk about some of those today during the webinar.
Awesome, great, thanks. Jeffrey Martin, who's Director of Product at WhiteSource and no stranger to our webinars. Hi, Jeff, great to see you again.
Nice seeing you again as well. Glad to be here.
Great, well, tell us a little bit about yourself, yeah.
Sure, so I'm Director of Product at WhiteSource. I specialize in open source security and vulnerability management and detection. So looking forward to this call, it should be fun.
Excellent, excellent. Next up is Vikram Kapoor, who is CTO and co-founder of Lacework and also no stranger to our webinars. Welcome, Vikram, it's great to see you.
Yeah, thanks, sir. Glad to be here.
Great,
I'm Vikram Kapoor. I'm co-founder and CTO here at Lacework. We started Lacework around 4 years ago to solve the cloud security problem, of which app security is a big part. So very happy to be here today.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Next up, we have John Stephen, who is CTO of Zero North, not a regular for our webinar, but hopefully that'll be changing soon. So John, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, everybody. John Stephen, CTO of Zero North for the past 2 decades, CTO of Cigital and Codescope. Spent the last 2 decades, building and writing on application security.
Excellent, excellent, great. And then finally, we have Brian Joe, who's the Senior Director of Product Management at Signal Sciences. Brian, thanks so much for joining me today. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thanks, Charlene. Glad to be here. Yeah, so my name is Brian Joe, Senior Director of Product at Signal Sciences. We're an application security company, and my role is really to lead our growth product management team, where we focus on growing our business and helping our customers protect their applications.
Okay, all right, great. Well, as you can see, we have some true experts on today's panel. So I expect we're going to have lots and lots of great information for our audience today. Today's event is actually a part of a conversation that is based on our latest ebook, and it says DevOps, but it's actually Security Boulevard. We are going to be offering this ebook as part of the download, and so as a webinar attendee, you do get a copy of the download code to get to the ebook, and you should have received it. If not, you'll be getting it very, very soon. The ebook is also going to be available for download on Security Boulevard, so you can always find it there. All right, so without further ado, I'd like to get into this because I know we have a ton of stuff we need to go over. But I thought what we could do is kind of kick off today's conversation with just taking a look at the state of application security. It's a big topic, I know, but really would like to hear from our experts on where they feel application security stands today. Like where are we in relation to the market of application security? What we're seeing that's good or bad. And then, obviously what's needed in application security, because we certainly aren't closer to the end than we are the beginning. So, John, with your background, I thought you would be the perfect person to start off our conversation. So, why don't you give us just a couple words about where you see the state of application security today?
Couple words, dumpster fire. No, so application security is in a different place than it was 20 years ago. 20 years ago, we used to say it's the software, stupid. And people were convinced that if they purchased a firewall, they'd be done. We can tell from the BSIM, the Building Security and Maturity Model Study, which measures security initiatives, that security is improving, and that people are taking application and infrastructure security seriously. It used to be only centralized governance initiatives, but we've even succeeded in convincing a lot of people that security is everybody's job. And so we're starting to see product-centric or engineering-led security initiatives in certain firms. And that's gaining a lot of traction, and you see a lot of dovetail between the engineering-led organization and DevOps. And I think that's partly because businesses are transforming. If you talk to an apparel company, they'll say, look, we engage our customers digitally, and every element of our business is digital. Car manufacturers will say, we're a computer and a software firm on 4 wheels. So, those firms are looking to create software-defined security governance to keep up with the pace of their delivery of business functionality to their customers. And so again, that ties in with a cultural initiative. It ties in with outsourcing initiatives like adoption of open source and the move to the cloud. And the challenge we face as we digitally transform our businesses and then security is that there's tremendous fragmentation in the security vendor space. Gartner says that 2/3 of the firms you deal with as security vendors may be out of business in 2 to 3 years. And they also say things like, if you're a large security initiative, you may need as many as 10 to 30 vendor relationships to accomplish your security governance goals. That's insane. That's intractable, right? And so we have these sort of parallel forces working for and against us, where we're seeking to automate, and automation is the key to keeping pace with the business. But the mechanisms we're using to automate are suffering some challenges, either subject matter expertise, scale, or fragmentation. And so if we can manage those challenges, we can succeed, and those end up being net benefits to us. But of course, there are perils.
All right, great. That's a lot of information there, John. Thanks very much. Jeff, you want to pile on there, or you got something to say about it?
Sure. Yeah. I think there's 2 other pieces there. One is, while everybody's taking security more seriously, the sheer interconnectedness of everything is raising its own challenges. Yes, we're putting software into cars and airplanes, but we're also connecting them to many, many, many other services and applications. That really, really ratchets up the risk profile of everything from thermostats to, your car. At the end of the day, that interconnectedness raises its own challenges, especially around scale, and the relationships you have, not just with your vendors, I'm glad you pointed that out, John. You have to have a lot of vendors, but all your partners, all of your actual technical partners that you're interacting with, plus some you don't even know about. So those just sheer interconnectedness of modern applications is raising some very interesting challenges. And the other point I would raise is the geopolitic angle, which is definitely creating some interesting problems. Application is generally developed globally, and we do have concerns, especially in specific sectors, about how state actors are behaving.
I hadn't thought about that. Tom, Brian, Vikram, anybody else have anything they want to add?
I'd like to add one more thing to it. In the last few years, the way cloud has developed and how DevOps has developed, I think it is an API centric world, and the connectedness of different things kind of has widened the security attack vector a lot. And earlier, a lot of the things that app developers didn't need to take care of for their security now is something that they need to think about. For example, long time back, you could assume that you are in a data center which is secure, there is a perimeter, and you can therefore do certain things like not encrypt inside the data center or have credentials, things in a shared memory because you're running in a big white box. With the microservices and new architecture, a lot of that thing has become kind of gone out of the door. So I think the challenges for application security for developers has gone up a lot, and they need to be more aware of it.
Good point.
Yeah, I'd also say too, we've seen just things change over the years with regulations, and just take data privacy, for example, right? GDPR is just changing companies and the way that they develop applications because, now we have to be concerned about our users' privacy, and our companies don't need to get fined for mishandling that data, and so that I think changes the game with appsec as well as these new types of regulations.
Yeah, I agree. I think all of these factors that the team has mentioned are really pointing to the fact that it's kind of cool to be in security again. Like there's all of this new technology, and businesses are moving so much of their applications into the cloud that I think there's just a lot of attention and focus from an industry perspective on all the different types of tooling and vendors that you can work with. But I think sometimes the thing that gets lost is actually a lot of the legacy applications. So even though a lot of the new applications are being built in the cloud or being built with modern infrastructure, a lot of the business critical applications that are supporting these sort of more traditional businesses, I like the example of automotive that John shared about software on 4 wheels. A lot of those systems are actually built on older systems, and I think that as an industry, we can do a little bit better at thinking about how to support those older applications as well as the new stuff.
Great point. So, John, you actually brought up a point also that that a number of the security vendors that are around today are not going to be around in two or 3 years or some time frame in the future. Do you think that that's and this is for anybody, but do you guys think that there's going to be that attrition? Is it going to be because the technology is going to just move that fast, or are these companies going to get acquired, or where do you kind of see that heading?
Yeah, so I worked in for Synopsys. I worked in security M&A for about 18 months and studied this problem, and of course the analysts have studied it as well. There's a few factors that they list publicly that are at play here. There is going to be some consolidation. When you look at some of the vendors out there, especially in the cloud native zero trust or container security spaces, there's a really interesting innovation happening, but a lot of the productization is following that MVP lean startup approach. And so what you're seeing in the market is a feature. And what enterprises say is, well, this is great. This is going to work for one of my business units. It's going to work for this one team on this one tech stack. But I need to take care of this behavioral access control risk across the board, or I need to harden my orchestration of my components across the board, because with microservice orientation, with move to hybrid cloud from my data center, the fabric that is my business app involves 4 or 5 of those stacks. So we'll see consolidation, from feature to real product and capability that people will deploy. Some of these things may not make it, and so you'll see that maybe a third of the time. When you read the reports, they'll tell you that you're stuck here, right? So as a customer, in a business, you've got to deploy business functionality to your customers rapidly. 18 months is not sufficient. People used to think they had 36 months to grow a security program. They don't. As they bring new lines of business to market, they have to secure them with things that Tom and others have mentioned about GDPR. They have to comply quickly. So you have to innovate on the security front, and you're left to navigate the trade-off. Do I wait for the consolidation and maturation of the vendor product space? Do I buy in now knowing that there's going to be a lot of turbulence? Or do I maybe use my own engineers to produce my own home rolled? And what we see is a lot of sort of cognitive friction there. The people are taking hybrid approaches and doing a little bit on their own where they can. They're picking, key vendor choices where they can, and they feel like they're making a good bet and they can put their money on that square effectively. And sometimes they are deferring. So it's a bit of a mix. It's a bit of a trade-off, business trade-off kind of scenario is what we're seeing right now.
So what do you guys think as far as, maybe looking into the future a little bit and kind of comparing and contrasting the way security is approached today by organizations and the disparate number of vendors that they're working with? Do you guys see that as changing, that at some point there will be, maybe there will be the ability for organizations to work with fewer vendors who have more comprehensive portfolios, if you will? Or, I'm just trying to think, just the sheer number of vendors who offer security offerings that organizations are working with these days just seems inordinately large, and it seems like it's unsustainable the way that it is. So what do you guys think? I mean, am I wrong? Is that, is it big?
I think there's definitely going to be consolidation, and people are going to be looking for a comprehensive kind of solution and a platform. And partly because if you kind of think about how cloud is growing, and there are like three big public cloud providers, and then you add to like a lot of other cloud providers that are there, and for every one of these providers, they add like services really fast, or the existing services have new functionalities all the time, and people are now kind of trying to do best of breed solutions. Like, it's not that if I'm on AWS, so I only use AWS for everything, but I might decide to use GCP BigQuery, or I may decide to use in some other cloud provider some functionality. And from a CISO's perspective, you don't even control what you do, because DevOps basically decide where they want to host their application. So fundamentally, given that it's very broad, growing really fast and maturing, there is a need for a platform that kind of goes across the board. Otherwise, you end up with like a lot of vendors you have to deal with, and then you have to take the risk of going and joining between them to make sure you didn't miss something, which becomes a really hard problem in general.
Great. Okay. Well, before we move on, any
I want to add one thing. That, I mean,
Sure.
There's been a few studies here, and it's kind of been a joke on LinkedIn, right? That CISOs tend to drink more than other executives, right? And the explanation that's offered to that could be many things. Is the lack of fulfillment of promises on the part of security vendors. And so I think even though we have a staffing shortage in this industry, which you see as a response where people are trying to bring some of this capability in-house and build it themselves, as a response to that inability to deliver. And so if you can pick a platform play and really partner with a vendor to generate a solution that maybe works for you. But what we see people is doing good enough security based on open source and things that they're able to bring in-house as a response. And so even though those maybe sort of joke studies or maybe not the most scientific, I think we have to take it seriously.
Yeah, whoever said that hasn't hung out enough sales executives. But one thing I will say, though, application security is gigantic by itself as a topic. Yeah. So I think you're going to see a lot of commoditization and consolidation in some areas and not in others. So I think it's fair to say that some of the more commoditized pieces will eventually be folded into kind of the big places, right? Your repo providers, your AWS, a lot of that does end up getting commoditized and brought in. Mm-hmm. But I don't think that's true of every area of application security, especially if you were to include the services, which is gigantic.
True. Okay. All right. Well, I kind of get the feeling we could actually talk about this topic all day, but we're not going to, because we're going to move on to the next one, which is application security and the cloud. And specifically with this, I'm really interested in hearing what you guys have to say about how the cloud has impacted application security. Especially when we're talking about application development, but there are obviously IoT, so many different factors that we could include with cloud when we're talking about cloud security. So with that in mind, Vikram, I thought you would be our first contestant today on appsec in the cloud. Why don't you share with us what, some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So I think one of the big things which has happened with cloud, and particularly public cloud and appsec, is that the clouds, all three cloud providers basically have a shared responsibility model, where a lot of the functionality that used to be in data center security is kind of divided up between applications and infrastructure. So security off the cloud kind of belongs with the infrastructure and the public cloud, and security in the cloud, which basically means application security and everything that's happening on top of the cloud, ends up going with the customer. And with the customer, it kind of goes to the application developer at some point, some parts of it. Some of it that we see there's a shift left movement where a lot of the things like vulnerability management has been pushed down to the developers, where they have to worry about it when they actually create containers, and they have to make sure they kind of handle them at that level. But at the same time, they also have to be cognizant of, let's say, least privilege and how they're setting up the cloud itself, because at the end of the day, it's a set of APIs that you get to set up what you want to set up. But fundamentally, as a developer, you really need to understand when you're doing an application, like what is the framework in which I'm working in, right? Like what services I'm going to use, where I'm going to get my secrets from, how am I going to make sure the lack of perimeter means that I can still be secure and not have to rely on my peers for security just because they're my peers. Or for example, firewalls used to protect earlier data centers, but now as a developer, I have to think of security groups and actually make sure that those things are properly set in least privileged manner. So I think a lot of the security issues in the cloud really stem from shared security model, where the customer has to worry about a lot of application security, and then they have to do a lot of things that otherwise would have been typically earlier be IT or ops responsibility, has actually now moved to the developer responsibility, because that's what those are the guys who are actually setting up the environments and setting up the APIs and setting up VPCs and security groups and IAM and all of those services essentially.
All right, great. What else? What do you guys think about cloud security and or application security in the cloud? I mean, what are some of the considerations that organizations maybe should know, aren't thinking about? I don't know. Whatever, what makes you, what's cringeworthy when we talk about AppSec in the cloud?
Ooh, cringeworthy. I'm going to take that one. I have dealt with so many actual software vendors providing their own services in the cloud who will just go, oh, we're on AWS, we're okay. That sheer just trusting that somebody else has an ISO or a good certification and they're going to be fine, without even the full understanding that all they're doing is providing the infrastructure. Your application is what needs to be certified or scanned or tested. It's astounding the lack of knowledge there, and I wonder how much of it's willful, but I've just lost track of the number of software vendors I've heard say, no, we're good, we're on Azure. Like, great, what are you doing to secure your application, guys?
Well, go ahead, sorry.
I was just going to say, I don't think it's just the vendor community that has that problem. I think it's actual developers and the dev teams as well. Like, they have so many things to do. They've got backlogs of hundreds of items to work on, all of which are typically like customer facing or like delivering a feature or business value. And when security comes along with here's a list of other things you need to also worry about, it's just a challenge for them to like make the mind share and take the time to actually think about how to architect their infrastructure, architect all of those things with a security mindset. And I think for the developer community, I think there's going to be just a growing need for development teams to just start to add security into the mix, or just pick up that security skill set. And I think that's just an ongoing process that we're going to see evolve in the industry over time.
Yeah, I'd like to jump on and maybe offer what security in the mix means. So, when you had a data center, you may not have known what you were running and what you were responsible for, but at least it existed in those four walls. And maybe it crept out to the office and a Starbucks if you allowed remote work. But with the cloud, we've got self-service IT, and the barrier to entry is as low as a credit card. And we've seen several situations over the last 3 months in the news where people have been breached or embarrassed, at least, because things that they were responsible for were vulnerable. They weren't configured correctly, or they didn't have the proper access control. And it may not have been their code. It might have been third-party code, or it might have been third-party code that they bought, but a developer wrote. And so, inventorying self-service, cloud-based IT assets is job number one for this ISO. If you don't know what you have, what your pile is, then you can't secure it. So I'd say that, that if you're responsible for a security initiative, that's something you need to get a handle on. And what we found when we've studied firms that look at that inventory problem is that it's an inside out question, right? Inventorying what you know you have. It's an outside in scanning problem. Figure out by crawling what is yours that you didn't know about. And then you have to typically take some other techniques to figure out where the edge cases are. But I'd say, that's one of the key movers we've seen in application security over the last 3 years is software defining your inventory, especially as it pertains to that self-service cloud-based asset step.
I think so.
Yeah,
definitely, like visibility is one of the main use cases, and just very quickly, like one of the things I would point out would be like I've been writing applications for like 20 years, and 15 years back I didn't have to worry about security as much because the data center guy would used to do that by defining a perimeter, but now it's my problem and I need to worry about it.
Yeah, I think everyone was kind of touching on misconfigurations, developers putting up systems that maybe they don't quite understand the technology or quite understand how everything works. There's an interesting bit of research done by Gartner a while back that said by 2022, at least 95% of all cloud security failures will be the customer's fault. So that says a lot right there, that a lot of organizations just aren't ready for the technology that they're about to deploy. And unfortunately, like a few of you have commented that developers are responsible for security, networking, all those IT type things that they have never done before.
So do you think that's a question of possibly not enough education on the part of the developers or the cloud services providers? Do we need to be having more discussions about who's responsible for what when it comes to application security in the cloud? Or is it more a matter of developers recognizing that this is something that they have to take on and then they can't leave it to somebody else?
So I'm an organizational behavior wonk, and I will say that for the most part, I think it's mostly a symptom of time to learn and keep up isn't built into many developers or DevOps guys' job. At the end of the day, stuff moves quickly. What you learned 2 years ago is no longer relevant. What you need to know tomorrow is sometimes cloudy. Wow, that's a bad
No pun
pun.
intended.
Yeah, that pause, that actually stopped me. So organizations aren't the greatest, especially in these areas, of allocating time in people's job to go and keep up to date. So it's an education problem, but I would say it's actually a resource allocation problem. Nobody values education highly enough.
Good point. Anybody want to agree, disagree?
I think it's a specialized tooling problem also. Like you need specialized tools to solve the problem.
Yeah, I agree with that. I was going to say that the pace of change is too great for the individual to be held solely responsible, but there are some really interesting forays into, guardrails, right? You can get them for free with Amazon Guard Duty, but others, a Redlock or a Divi Cloud that'll help you with some of these things, altitude. Again, the challenge is back to fragmentation.
Yeah, I'd like to put on tooling. I think one of the key things is like, there is tooling that exists, but oftentimes it's overwhelming and there's like alert fatigue, you're getting all these notifications and logs, right. And you just don't have time to sift through all of that. So I think the key is really having tools that are smart and easy to use, that you like using, that are consumer grade technology and not just some sort of like traditional B2B software that's, maybe harder to use. And yeah. I think when a developer is faced with those types of tools and getting those types of insights that are curated and delivered to them in an easy way, then it makes it a lot easier to understand where am I actually getting attacked versus, which of these items in a list is actually most important. So.
And tool selection is a giant problem in and of itself, but to tie it back to our previous conversation, just simple act of evaluating a tool, whether the vendor is going to be around in 6 months, that takes a significant amount of time that is also not often allocated for. Those tend to be ad hoc reactive projects in a lot of cases, instead of really thinking things out.
So it doesn't sound like there's any solution that is, definitely not easy, but it's a problem that remains to be solved. Basically, we're not gonna find a solution for it anytime soon, not until developers can be cloned or something like that. So.
I would say that there is some hope in how much of a developer's job is getting increasingly automated.
Yeah.
You know, in 10 years from now, we might be having a very different conversation about AIs and all sorts of other things.
True.
But you know, in a way, you might be right about, yeah, how do we clone the developers? How do we spread that out?
All right.
Yeah.
Especially since we're piling more stuff on them, because to Vikram's point, 10 years ago, he didn't have to deal with security. And now, it's part of his job function now, or it's part of the developer's job function. So, maybe there's a larger conversation to be had about, sharing responsibilities in light of what now has to happen during the entire DevSecOps process. So anyway, all right, well, let's go ahead and move along to our next topic, which is AppSec and newer technologies. And I'm thinking specifically of these microservices and containers, Kubernetes, edge networking, anything that kind of makes people stop and say, oh, well, that's different. How are these things impacting application security? And Tom, because you're in that space and you know all about it, I'd really like to hear what opinion you have on this to start us off.
Yeah, it's really fascinating just what's happened over the last year or so with technologies like Kubernetes and containers, and how quickly they have evolved, and how quickly I'm seeing developers and organizations just launching and deploying these systems, unfortunately, without not thinking very much about their configurations or the security ramifications of these types of deployments. And that's kind of evidenced by what we find in our penetration tests. A lot of these things, like Kubernetes, for example, if you really dig into the technology, it's very complex. And it's changing constantly. I mean, I think they're releasing security updates almost on a weekly or biweekly basis nowadays. So if you're a developer and you're deploying it, and if you haven't thought about security, you are potentially leaving your organization at risk. And some of the things that we're finding that developers are leaving out there about these configurations. So for example, it's very common now in like shared public GitHub repositories for developers to leave API keys and other sensitive information, because they are just rapidly developing these applications so fast, and the collaboration is needed by different developers and all these other things, that they're leaving these things exposed. So a lot of this gets back to understanding the technology that you're deploying, and being not just a developer that's writing code, but understanding the security risks of these new technologies.
So one of the things that I've heard spoken by a couple of different folks is the fact that a lot of companies are trying to use more traditional application security technologies on these newer technologies, such as containers and microservices and Kubernetes, and that is to me kind of a recipe for disaster, because they just don't work, right? Anyone?
Well, I think that's a bit of a loaded question. I think the thing with microservices, Kubernetes, when I think of them, it's just increasing the amount of virtualization that's occurring down from the infrastructure to the actual application, breaking it down into smaller and smaller pieces. And so I think there's a degree to which traditional application security technologies can still protect it, but it's different, right? Like if you think about a traditional monolithic application, there's one way in and out, ingress, egress. And so you can protect that application right there. But if you break it down into lots of different containers and lots of microservices, now there may be dozens or even hundreds of different interfaces between all these different services that are probably even more challenging to keep track of and understand like what the intended interaction between each of them is. And so I think the thing that's that's really going to change is that the application security approach just has to be more cognizant of microservices, right? Instead of just being happy to sit at the ingress egress point, we actually have to dig deeper and get closer and closer to each service and have a good baseline understanding of what type of behavior and traffic patterns are supposed to be going in and out of each service. And certainly there's a lot of tools that you can lift and shift from a traditional security approach to do that, but then there's also going to be room for more customized or more specialized type of tooling.
So do you guys see possibly the rise of security technologies that are specific to containerization and Kubernetes and microservices? Those technologies that speak specifically to those type of architectures versus, as we said, the more general application security technologies?
Yeah, I think so. I think.
Go ahead.
Sorry. To that point, like I actually strongly believe that a lot of the old technology stack is basically just not suitable for the newer technologies. And partly because, earlier people would be able to tell you the IP address of the database server, or where is their, some other service is located, and what's the port number for certain things that they're running. But now with Kubernetes and pods and a BGP overlay on top of Kubernetes, you basically have zero idea what's happening if you're looking at your network only. So fundamentally, a lot of the security tooling has to go from network to the application layer, to Brian's point, where you have to understand what container you have and what it's doing and what it's supposed to be doing and what developer coded it to do. And then from that, derive the security properties of the system. You have to kind of go to a more granularity than the network layer. And one of the other things which I kind of find very interesting is that I don't believe that the change of pace is actually going to slow down anytime soon, or in fact, it's usually exponential. And what I mean by that is that the way Kubernetes developed in the last 3-4 years is amazing, and how it has actually become prevalent path for the cloud today. And fundamentally, if the security doesn't keep up with a lot of these things, with automation and with a comprehensive solution, if there's just no way to keep up, because 5 years from now, this is going to be a really interesting and a different world with a lot of tooling that we don't even know right now and we're not discussing to be the de facto standard. And then the security would have to catch up to that level. So I think the world where, you take 16 months or 18 months or 36 months to actually do your security analysis is gone. And the DevOps and the security has to really move with the DevOps speed, which is really fast. And how cloud's developing, how Kubernetes is developing, how applications are developing, I think a lot of this will boil down to security as an industry providing a comprehensive answer, which can kind of figure out what's going on from not just visibility, but from breach detection and the dependencies between these things, which is highly complicated, and deliver that as a solution to the customers. Otherwise, not much hope of getting a good answer out of it.
It's interesting because I remember having, security conversations in the past that was, pretty much revolved around security needs to stay one step ahead of the hackers, or at least keep up with them. And now it sounds like security needs to keep up with just the technology, and we need, we're kind of chasing ourselves when it comes to application security. So, with that in mind,
so are the hackers.
Yeah, but I guess my biggest question, my question is, what is the biggest catalyst, if you will, for newer security technologies? I mean, is it keeping up with the hackers and the evil bad actors, or is it making sure that we can address the newer technologies and keep those relatively secure? Or is it both?
We're talking about different rhythms and different cadences. Developers are lazy people, and I mean that as a compliment, not an insult. So they share code highly effectively. Right? The open source and public repo movements are proof of that. I think it's fairly obvious that attackers share working exploits effectively where they're not valuable. And so you've got two groups of people who are highly effective at being lazy and sharing. Security, maybe driven by the vendor space where things are proprietary advantage, hasn't been as effective. Tying to what Vikram and what Brian said, actually almost everybody, if we're going to do this infrastructure as code thing, and if we're going to buy into Kubernetes and containers, then more and more of the holistic picture of what your software is from the business perspective is going to be infrastructure code, not like source code in Java like it was 10, 15 years ago. And so it's very true that the scanning technologies have not figured that out. You can't go buy an effective static analysis tool for your infrastructure code, your Terraform, your Helm, your Chef, your CloudFormation technology stuff yet. That's a big gap, and we've got to address that gap. We do it with little scripts now as organizations. So in order to see a holistic picture of your business application's risk, we need to fill that gap. But the reality is, CISOs are moving at a different cadence. They're talking to the board. They may be talking quarterly, monthly. They may be making, budgetary decisions on a yearly basis. The CIO and the CISO who agreed in a Fortune 500 to standardize on container security last year may realize that they're only halfway through their container security implementation, but their developers are moving to functions as a service, and the IT organization doesn't have the container expertise to finish the container rollout. So functions as a service is going to replace it. And so the differences in those cadences, the OODA loop of analyze and attack, and the way that initiatives budget and do response as defense are just different time horizons. And so we're always going to suffer from that innovation gap. And that's a challenge that we're going to have to face in terms of agility and DevOps. And it's why you hear so many vendors trying to pour into that, security as part of DevOps agility, because of that natural cadence mismatch. And I don't know that there's a perfect answer to fixing that mismatch, but certainly right now we're not synced up. Does that make sense?
I still think there's a lot of room in the sense that the enterprise is relatively slow moving if you think about the entirety of their application. So for example, we have a large media customer who is fully bought into DevSecOps. They've hired a lead of DevSecOps, and they're very focused on protecting all of their applications, moving everything to containers, moving everything to microservices. But they themselves are always playing catch up with the rest of their business and this isn't just the security team, this is the actual sort of DevOps team, because there's so much legacy systems, so much legacy applications. And then in that particular industry, there's a lot of consolidation going on. So they're always picking up new applications from companies that got bought or got acquired. And so I think there's just a lot of room into catching up with the problem just by looking backwards. But I agree in the sense that looking forwards is where all the new applications are going to be coming from. All the new applications are going to be built with a more microservices based architecture. And I think one of the interesting things that we've seen in some of our research is that when you think about microservices containers, you would think that would just be for startups or newer companies that are adopting those. But what we found is actually it's large companies of almost any age that are really adopting them so that they can more easily break up the work that they have among their existing teams.
Nice. Okay. Anybody else?
If I may,
Sure.
if I jump back in, I apologize, but I want to pimp Brian's product a little bit. There are products that have competitors in the same space, but because of the way their product is implemented, it's easier to scale across an organization. And once they've been shown successful, match both the legacy and the more modern leaning development groups because of the way they fit in. And so I would encourage, whether it's a container-based strategy or a proxy-based strategy, or there are some sort of inflection points or fulcrums where CISOs can look for easier to implement products that have highly effective, results. And I think that's key to overcoming this trade-off.
I think that's our worldview too. Right now, even though people are moving to Kubernetes and containers, but vast majority applications today are still the way they used to be, because it takes time to kind of do migration of these applications from point A to point B, especially if they're working in the old environment. You don't want to really just disrupt them for no reason. So fundamentally, it takes time to do that. But I think the transition is happening, and the tool sets can help you kind of manage both sides of it. But to Shaline's point, right, I think, are you chasing yourself or are you chasing attackers, right? To me, I think it's actually the same problem, where the way technology is developing, you have to always keep thinking about how somebody might be able to attack it, right? In the old world, when we used to have north and south and a perimeter, we used to think of ingress and outgress, and I could think of a way in which I can protect myself because those are the two places I need to control. But today, if I look at AWS, I look at all the services, all the APIs, and all the policies I can give. it's even hard to imagine how somebody might attack me. And hackers can get really innovative there, and they can go from API key they find in a GitHub account, for example, which they got through an Okta via phishing, to actually being able to take out your S3 buckets and your RDS snapshots, because there's a way to go from that to your actual data that you're trying to protect, which you as a person, a security person, may not be able to think of, or a developer may not be able to think of. So I think fundamentally, but the pace is not going to slow down. So essentially, you would have to invest in automated tooling and be able to kind of deal with this problem in a more through computers also, right? Like being able to use technology to solve the problem. And that's where I think a lot of the automation and machine learning comes into play. And who solves it in a comprehensive manner is still TBD, but I think as an industry, we have to solve it.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay. All right, I'm going to go ahead and push us forward here. Our last topic before we get onto the question and answer period, and we're about 14 minutes to the top of the hour. So I just kind of like to get a kind of a little brain dump, if you will, from all of our panelists on what they consider some of the best practices for application security. Jeff, I'd like you to start on this one, because I know you always have something to say about this.
Yeah, I'm like the practice and process guy. Look, at the end of the day, a lot of this is stuff that hasn't changed in 30 years, right? The best practice for application security: know what you have, know what it connects to, know who your users are and how they're using it and what they connect to. How do you secure the ends that aren't necessarily directly in your application, like that database server you decided to have in the back room? None of that's really changed in 30 years, even with all these new technologies. It's just become a scale problem, because instead of having a couple of endpoints, you now have, a few million. So, one thing I kind of would like to kind of focus on here is somebody asked a question about it, so I want to bring it in. One of the best practices for application security is having a team that understands what application security is, dividing the roles appropriately, and actually allowing them to execute on those rules effectively. Sure, tooling's important, but at the end of the day, the tools are used by people, and those people need to be able to know what they're doing. So I think somebody had asked a specific question about that. Hopefully I covered it, but there we go.
All right, great. Brian, why don't you give us what you think is one of the, or two, best practices for application security?
Yeah, I mean, well, I'll give you three. We basically summarize it as C, secure, and scale. So C is just the practice of making sure you understand what you have, right? Not just broad coverage with some tool, but also just like intelligent insights as to what is actually going on. I think this is a similar point that Jeff made. Secure is just do the obvious stuff to protect your infrastructure, like block bad traffic, like put in a WAF as an example. That's really easy, anyone can do it, and that can make a big difference. And then scaling is, again, I'm just repeating Jeff's greatest hits. It's just cover your whole enterprise, not just one application or the new stuff, but like everything, so that you understand the full impact to your business.
Excellent. Okay, Vikram.
Yeah. So I think very similar points. Like I think one of the first things is obviously getting visibility into your environment. Like if you don't know what you have and what it does or where it is, like it's very, very hard to secure anything. So you really need to focus on getting visibility into the environment across the board, whether it's containers or not, or Kubernetes, and kind of go with that. And I think the second thing I would kind of argue would be actually doing the right architecture, right design from very beginning, and bake in security early enough, not like, strap on at the end of the project. Like thinking about how what your DMZ is, what your different tiers are, which is again, last 30 years, you've kind of done that in the old data centers, but to, kind of still keep doing that and make sure you're following the least privilege model, and, not having any privilege anywhere that you don't really need to have is, one of the good architecture is one way to kind of go about making sure you are actually secure.
Great. Tom.
Yeah, I'd say I find it fascinating that a lot of organizations just aren't ready for full-on DevOps. I think a lot of people think they are, but they're still stuck in an agile, or they're not even doing agile. They're still doing kind of like this mix of waterfall agile thing. And so I think depending on your organization, if you're a startup, you're going to have different needs and requirements than a Fortune 500, right? And understand, your business and the business requirements, I think, are very important, and kind of choosing where you need to take your application security program. And of course, regulations and compliance also comes into that as well. And the other piece I'd add too is around developer education. I think that is an area that's rapidly changing, and depending on your developers, they're all going to want to be educated in different ways. The old standard of e-learning, right? We all kind of joke that no one listens to e-learning, no one watches those videos. For some developers, that actually might work for them. Others may need more innovation around like gamification, and they want to have fun with their training and learning about these new technologies. So I think each organization really needs to just take a step back and look at those needs and see where you want to go with your application security program.
All right, great. And last but not least, John.
Okay, so you need an owner. If no one's responsible, then no one's responsible for the security program. I'll go 5 for 5 and say you need the inventory. We've talked about that a lot. The third thing I would say is, in order to keep pace, you need to deliver the capabilities your application security initiative intends to sustain and scale as software and not as documents. So that's automation, that's tests, that's security features. It's not PDFs. Those three things will dominate.
Okay.
One last note I just wanted to mention here. Security does start with quality, and that's a whole separate problem. But at the end of the day, it's important to remember that when you're doing the security stuff.
So is it fair to say then that it starts and ends with quality?
Yeah, I would say that's fair. But I mean, at the end of the day, that three-sided triangle of quality, privacy, security, and appsec, we obviously don't talk too much about the privacy piece, but at the end of the day, those three things interrelate, and they're all incredibly important for how your company is viewed by your consumers, your customers.
So I was attending a keynote talk of Brian Kernighan, one of the co-authors of the C language, gave. And he made the point quickly that when's the last time you picked up a landline and didn't get a dial tone? He said that security is absolutely a subset of quality. It's assuring that the software does what it's expected to do and nothing else. And I thought that was very poignant.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I'm going to steal that line. That was great.
You heard it here, folks. Okay, so at this point, I'd like to go ahead and open things up for questions. We've gotten some great questions in, and I think we have time for maybe 2, maybe 3, and we have so many more than that. But let's go ahead and just dive right on in. So let's see, the first one, regarding vulnerability patch management, what are effective methods for SecOps and information assurance offices to establish areas of security responsibility with development teams? Anybody who wants to take that one? Anyone? Come on, guys.
I've never heard a question just go complete crickets.
I can take a crack at it. I mean, I think you got to prioritize, right? Like, you got to prioritize because there's always going to be a list longer than you have time to fix. So you just got to prioritize based on what's actually affecting your business the most. And so key to that is just having a conversation with your business team to understand like what vulnerability is actually affecting us the most and what's the generating the largest risk profile, and focusing on those. I think there's lots of tools that will, give you lists and try to connect them into the development process. But I think that before you start any of that, you really just have to understand what is the most important thing.
All right.
I think having a look at the risk in terms of whether it's available from outside the world or where is the vulnerability and how can it be hacked is kind of one good way to kind of assess the risk that Brian is talking about.
Yeah, and I think it just goes back to risk management, right? And understanding your assets, like we've all talked about, in this webinar of, understanding what you have and then classifying that, if you have multiple applications in your organization, classify those of what's your high risk, what's your low risk, what's in the middle, and then, adapt your tooling and the technologies that you buy to, to do security testing should be based on that risk model.
Yeah, I think the reason nobody wanted to answer it is because it's not the most fun answer in the world, which is basically do a risk analysis and realize what you can and can't do with the resources you have.
Yeah, well, there's in every job, there's stuff that we like to do and stuff that we have to do. So, yeah. All right.
I think the answer is really good. I would just point out some data. It ends up being super important that you prioritize. If you look at some of the industry leading tools, when you test their critical and high output for open source risk vulnerability, what you'll see is that it may be less than a third of those outputs that actually affect your organization. And then to Vikram's point, you may not care depending on the application's intrinsic risk. So that problem may be bigger than you expect it to be in terms of how little you need to prioritize to really get your risk-based job done.
We personally, we have a product that prioritizes for you. Didn't want to shill too much, but our own studies showed around 20% were actually effective. It's just the word we use, that are actually touching your code. And I mean, not having to worry as much about that other 80%. It's a good practice to go fix it anyways, but it is a big priority problem.
All right, great. I think we have time for one other question, then we're going to have to close it down. What do you consider the key things to consider for DAST and SAST tool to work effectively? So DAST and SAST. Anyone? Come on,
Another
guys.
entire webinar for each.
I know, I was about to say, it's such a big topic.
A loaded question.
I know. I don't.
I mean, Go ahead, Jeff.
I was going to say the number one thing is somebody who actually understands what it's doing and how to use it. At the end of the day, start there. Start with actually having somebody in your organization who knows how to use it. I've seen too many people try to implement those things and really not understand what they're doing or what their goals are.
Yeah, the tools are facilitative. They do not replace humans. They facilitate a human's scale. And in my own testing over a 2-decade period, I've noted that if you were to count the critical and high vulnerabilities, and those who have worked with me know this stat, but if you count the critical and high vulnerabilities that customers accept from SAST and DAST tools individually, regardless of the tool, you should expect to find between 5 and 20% of the report attributable to any one tool, meaning that each tool's ability to find the total set of things that matter to an application is relatively sparse. So if you're not committed to having a person that's competent to operate them, and really combining the results of those tools into a corroborative and more holistic view, then you should treat them like they are, which is linters. And so you don't have to start with experts. You don't have to start with multiple tools and correlating, but understand that that's where the game ends. And it's kind of like the difference between maybe a thermometer you stick in your mouth and anyone can use, and it's pretty simple, and an MRI. More expensive tooling requires more expensive operation, but you get a much more potentially commensurately thorough result. So treat it like a capability, put the right people in place to help operate it, and incrementally add value with the tool. Don't try to swallow the whole thing at once.
Excellent. Okay, on that note, we are going to have to close out the question and answer period. If we didn't get to your question, I apologize. We had a lot of questions, guys. And please know that everybody from today's webinar, meaning these guys, the panelists, will be getting a copy of all the questions. So I'm sure somebody from their organization will be more than happy to follow up with you offline. But I do, again, want to thank everybody who did submit questions. Also want to remind the audience that today's event has been recorded. So if you miss any or all of the event, or if you just want to watch it again because we had so much fun today, you will have the opportunity to do so. You will be getting an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And it's also going to be living on the Security Boulevard website. So you can always go there, just type in securityboulevard.com/webinars, look in the on demand section, and it should be right there waiting for you. So my esteemed panel of experts, Jeffrey, John, Brian, Vikram, and Tom, thank you all so much for your time. Great stuff. I was just so thrilled during today's webinar to get such great information from you guys. So thanks so much for your time. I really do appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie. Thanks, everybody.
Great. Excellent.
you.
Well, I am Charlene O'Hanlon, and I am signing off. Have a great day, everybody.